about preparing for the future after the 2025 Los Angeles fires. Last week, we talked about some of the work on transit evacuations, kind of looking back to see what happens. And today we're going to do a more forward-looking approach to kind of look at a community that may be impacted and think about how they can be prepared and be more resilient. So today's seminar is titled Lessons Learned from the Community Hardening Efforts in Solano Canyon, and we'll be joined by Minji Kim and colleague Sarah Harris, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We always like to start our events with a land acknowledgement. The Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and surrounding areas. As a public institution with funding from the sale of Indigenous lands, UCLA recognizes the responsibility to uplift Indigenous voices and histories in our work. So today we are going to hear from Minji Kim and Sarah Harris. Minji will start about the site planning studio, and then Sarah will give some of her perspective. We should have plenty of time for your questions. I'll also start with a couple of moderated questions, and then we'll conclude at 1:30. You're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A function or in the chat. So let me go ahead and introduce our two speakers for today. Minji Kim is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Planning here at UCLA. Her research focuses at the intersection of real estate development and urban planning, and she writes about land use regulations, master planning, and urban public finance. She aims her work on identifying ways to foster equitable real estate developments. Sarah Harris is an audio artist and public radio journalist working in California and Mexico on urban land use, education, and environmental equality. She's the co-founder of the nonprofit 1866 in historic Solano Canyon, and the group's mission is to foster community connections and preserve the rich and resilient history of Solano Canyon, which is a multilingual, multi-generational neighborhood in Los Angeles. So they had a great team. They'll work on this. And so I just want to acknowledge the students and all the people that worked on this, as well as the community partners, 1866, Northeast Trees, and Friends of Elysian Park. And this work was supported by funding through the UCLA Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Minji to start us off.
Well, thank you, Maddie, for the introduction. I am going to share my screen here. By the way, thank you so much for everyone who's joining us today. I really appreciate seeing familiar names and especially enjoy the presence of our community members from Solano Canyon. So thank you for being here. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you again. And so today, as Maddie introduced, I'm going to be introducing the 2025 Site Planning Studio project that we did. We did in collaboration with residents and community leaders of Solano Canyon. The studio took place between March and through May of last year. And over the course of the summer, I was able to work with two amazing research assistants to put together a report, which I'll be sharing at the end of the presentation. All right, so I'll get started. So as we, those of you who are present in the room are well aware that the 2025 LA fires was one of the most devastating events that happened in the LA region. Over 57,000 acres were burned, more than 18,000 structures were destroyed and killing at least 30 people. But as we know, wildfires are only increasing and intensifying. And this is a map. The map that you see on your right is a map that has been updated recently by CAL FIRE, the state's fire department, fire agency. And what it's showing is the fire hazard severity zone. So the red part is identified as very high fire hazard severity zone, and the orange color is identified as high fire hazard severity zone. And as we can see, it covers a lot of grounds, and nearly 3.7 people are in living currently in the either high fire or very high fire severity zones in California. So, in the wake of the LA fires, and then faced with this reality that, a lot of people live in these high fire risk zones, what are we going to do as urban planners, designers, thinking about making communities that are safer and more resilient to these, inevitable fire events? And where I started was sort of the inspiration that came from my colleague Liz Koslov at the planning department. Liz and her colleague wrote an op-ed around right shortly after the wildfires, the 2025 wildfires, arguing that instead of dreaming to retreat our way out of crisis, moving people out of the very high fire severity zones, or what's also or the WUI communities, we must learn how to live with fire. So that's where I got the inspiration that, okay, so we have a lot of people living in these very high fire risk zones. What can we do for these communities as urban planners and designers? So with that inspiration, I decided to partner with the community of Solano Canyon. So for those of you who are not familiar with the community and its location, it is located right next to the Dodger Stadium. So I think that would be the most easiest way to locate the community. It's a historic neighborhood. So it is the last remaining neighborhood of the original what is called the Chavez Ravine neighborhoods, which was home to Mexican American families in the 1940s. The entire Chavez Ravine neighborhoods were destroyed and bulldozed for public housing project, which never even materialized. But Solano Canyon, this sliver of community, survived. So that's the historic Solano Canyon, and it is nestled within a municipal park, Elysian Park. And as you see on this map on the right, it is located in a very high fire hazard severity zone. And you also see in orange the historic fire perimeters that is really close to the Solano Canyon neighborhood. All right, so why did I pick this neighborhood to work with? Solano Canyon technically is not a WUI community, considered a WUI community, the wildlife urban interface community. But as I mentioned, it is in a high fire hazard severity zone. I picked this neighborhood because of the unique and unique characteristics of the community. So it's a really small community, about 1,000 households, but it's a majority minority community, with Cantonese and Spanish being the primary, the majority of the households speaking Cantonese and Spanish as the primary language in their household. It's also densely developed. So if you think about WUI communities, the typical sort of picture that comes to your mind is the single family detached homes in a suburban subdivision. This community is not like that. It is urban, it's denser, and but it is also facing high fire risks. And also, the community is more than 50% renter population, which also poses challenges for preparing for fire resiliency and also evacuation. So these are the complications, and not complications, but the community characteristics that complicates fire resiliency effort and evacuation planning, which is why I thought this community was so unique and interesting to work with, to grapple with this issue of making existing communities more resilient. All right. So what the students, the group of students and I did, what we had to do was we just were thrown into this new topic, in the wake of 2025 wildfires, fire events. And I personally have not studied any fire related research, wildfire behaviors, and neither nor did the students have had much expertise or knowledge coming into this project. But at the same time, we are faced with this very time sensitive and pressing issue. So what we did was, as with any good planner would do, we did our rapid fire research. So we learned about the fire behaviors and the fuels and which could be both natural fuels and anthropogenic fuels that are created by humans. And we were looked into wildfire science and evacuation planning literature to be able to get a grounding in terms of how we want to approach analyzing the fire risks of Solano Canyon. So that's the first thing that we started with. And then, so this you could think of this the outcomes of the studio in two main chunks. So the first chunk is assessing the fire risks in Solano Canyon based on the knowledge that we gained from the rapid fire research. And then the second set of findings from this studio project are the solutions or the recommendations for the residents of Solano Canyon, community members of Solano Canyon. So for example, and these are some examples, the report itself and the analysis is a lot more extensive in terms of the factors that were analyzed. But I'm giving you an example of what we did. So students, for example, looked at the slope and the topography of Solano Canyon. So as you can see, Solano Canyon, it's a ravine, in the steeps, the hills are really steep and the topography is really steep. And so we talked about and studied discussed how fire might travel within such a topography, which we'll get to, will feed into our evacuation planning ideas that I'll talk about later. And then we also did, and this was created by the students, extensive mapping of invasive plant species that are currently present in Solano Canyon, which are known to be fuels for fires. So the most prevalent one you see here are the dark green, the eucalyptus trees and then we visited the site and saw the aging and deteriorating eucalyptus and dry eucalyptus trees that poses as fuel risks, and also mustard greens and other non-native species. And then we also mapped the non-native species and overlaid that with power lines to see where are the vulnerable points for potential, ignition points could be in the event of fires. And we also looked at building structures, how old are these buildings? So as you can see, a lot of the buildings are from before 19 even 40s. So what does it mean to prepare for fire with such an aged building stock? And what does it mean to home harden older building stock? So we identified where these older buildings are located and what are the risk levels of these buildings catching and spreading fire. We also mapped potential material hazards that are caused by humans. So as you can see in this image, that we saw cars that are just parked and used as like a dumping place or storage space in people's backyards. So, and those materials do pose high fire risks to the entire community. So this is a heat map of the material hazards that we identified in the community. We also looked at community characteristics, right? So as I mentioned, majority 61% of the households and population speak language other than English at home. And students also collected surveys and information in terms of the residents surveys and information from residents in terms of the challenges that they anticipate in terms of when it comes to evacuation. So see a lot of senior population, disability. What the literature calls as access and functional needs population. We did our best to identify where and what types of functional access and functional needs exist in Solano Canyon. And then also, as you can see, the Solano Canyon is very divided in terms of its income distribution. So there's a lot of the middle income population, as you can see, that's the bright blue, and then the lower income population is higher than the city of Los Angeles. So we discussed the mean implications for home hardening projects and evacuation given this income distribution. And then lastly, but not least, there's a lot of renter properties and renters in Solano Canyon. So we mapped which of the properties are renter occupied in Solano Canyon. And then, and as you can see, there are a lot. But what the pie chart on your right is showing is that 12% of these renter properties are actually properties owned by residents that live in Solano Canyon versus 88% are non-resident, are owners that don't live in Solano Canyon. So an example of such a building is what you see in the bottom. All right, so now turning to evacuation planning and emergency preparedness. So as I mentioned in the topography slide, what the students did was an exercise to conduct exercise and scenario plan. So in terms of where the fire starts and how it would spread based on the topography analysis that we did, as well as the evacuation and road analysis that we did. And we also did road width analysis, which of the Solano Canyon's internal roads are more prone to be congested or likely to pose hazard during time of evacuation. And then this kind of relates to what was the part one of the webinar that was presented last week regarding population that don't own a car, which so last week's presentation highlighted that population that without a car are going to be the ones that are going to either walk, bike, or take transit to evacuate, and then they are more likely to be renters, racial minorities, and that's exactly the case in Solano Canyon as well. All right, now turning more to the recommendation and side. This is the home hardening part of the recommendation that I'll first talk about. So as some of you may be aware, the concept of home ignition zone has come to the forefront of creating plans and making existing WUI communities more resilient to wildfires. And this idea is that there's the home ignition zone is defined as three different zones. So zone 0, 2, 1, and 2. Zone 0 is the immediate zone. That's so between 0 to 5 feet of your home. The immediate zone is 5 to 30 feet, and then the extended zone is 30 to 100 feet. So in a typical suburban setting, this home ignition zone is applied this concept is applied, and then there are best practices in terms of what can be done in zone 0, in zone 1, and in zone 2. And there are, like in terms of landscaping materials, in terms of gardening strategies, in terms of removing plants and inflammable materials. This is how the current state of best practices and in home hardening best practices exist. However, if you overlay that ignition zone to Solano Canyon, it is not difficult to see that all of these zones overlap with everyone else's property. So if you take this property, for example, maybe the immediate zone is within one's own control, but everything else just overlaps with your neighbors. What this diagram really shows is that, unless everyone and all the property owners are on board and are working towards home hardening and community hardening, it is difficult to achieve the community resiliency that we would need for making urban communities and denser urban communities more resilient to fire events. So what we did was, instead of assuming this typical suburban setting, we applied the best practices in the context of Solano Canyon's topography and layout, and try to see like which ones are the ones that we could apply and make sense in Solano Canyon, and which ones are not inapplicable. So this was the exercise, and we sort of came up with recommendations for what can be done in the context in Solano Canyon's context. We also recommended suggested native species palette for gardening, which native species are well maintained and well irrigated. Native species are known to be known to serve as fuel breaks and fire breaks rather than be serving as fuels. So we suggested native species palette. We also had created like a resident friendly or reader friendly, easy to read home hardening handbook for Solano Canyon's residents to be distributed, and for that, resident education, community education, so that the collective action that I just mentioned can be taken. And then switching to more of the community-wide hardening ideas, sort of the big picture ideas that we had, students came up with pedestrian route improvements. So as I mentioned, because of the percentage of population that do not own a car in Solano Canyon, there is more high likelihood of like evacuation by walking. So students propose putting lights and safety lights and sidewalk upgrades to be able to facilitate that evacuation by foot. And then there is an existing reservoir in Solano Canyon. So students sort of reimagine the reservoir as both serving a recreational function and a potential source of water in the event of fire. So in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the mapping of power lines and eucalyptus trees poses risks as potential ignition points. So we mapped places where those the eucalyptus trees and power lines intersect, and suggested those sites, nodes, as key points of intervention where, if and when power lines could be undergrounded, these are the points that should be the focus of intervention. Students also thought about how parks we can think of and use parks as potential fuel breaks between ignition points and structures in Solano Canyon. And then what they did was coming up with this matrix of the time frame of intervention and then the cost of intervention to be able to sort of give the community members an idea of where to focus their efforts and resources and attention on, and prioritize the projects as the community thinks about home hardening and community hardening moving forward. And then, so moving on to the implementation side. So those were the two main findings that came out of the studio. But we also were very cognizant of the implementation side. That there could be a lot of interesting and exciting ideas, but how do we get those ideas to be actually, implemented and take place in the real world. So students, the first place that we started was thinking about major stakeholders. So if you see that map on the left, the brick colored parcels are privately owned, but the rest are either institutional owners. So the green is LA Recs and Parks, which is the municipal park, Elysian Park. The dark blue is the Dodgers stadium, owned and managed by the Dodgers. And then the yellow is Caltrans, and there's a school site. So those are the institutional owners that really control the land around surrounding Solano Canyon that have and which is why it is critical for these large landowners, the institutional landowners, to be on board with community hardening and home hardening efforts. So we mapped out who the major stakeholders are. And then for residents of Solano Canyon, we also identified, who are the stakeholders and agencies that could help in terms of home hardening, land use, vegetation and waste management, as well as for the renter population, the tenants' rights groups. And then in terms of implementation, so these are some of the flyers that came out of our studio project when we did our community events. So we recommend that these events and the community hardening efforts and organizing efforts be done in both translated in both Spanish and Cantonese to engage with the multilingual and multicultural population in Solano Canyon, and then because of that higher, the majority renter population in Solano Canyon, we also who are understandably less engaged in terms of property management, maintenance, and they might not know, renters in Solano Canyon might not know their rights in terms of asking for land, for maintenance, brush clearance to their landlords. So we created this guide, fire safety guide for the tenants of Solano Canyon as a outcome of this studio project as well. So we shared all of the work that we did through the studio with the community. We hosted 2 events during the quarter. The first one was a learning experience. The first one was presenting the analysis part, the first findings part of the studio project. And then the last one, the second one, which is the picture that you see on your right, presented both, or it wasn't in terms of, it presented as a presentation, but more so engagement and sort of a fun outreach event to get community members to, come out and actually interact and meet with neighbors that are concerned and are working towards this issue. So we didn't want to be presenting ourselves as delivering any findings. And this outreach event was more. It was titled "Community Conversations," as you can see on the poster on your left. So we wanted to serve as a starting point of a conversation that will take hold in the community about around fire safety and around collective action for enhancing that fire safety. So, and it was a huge success. It was attended by more than 50 residents of Solano Canyon, and we students and I truly enjoyed meeting the community members and very much appreciated their time and commitment to their community. And we could tell that there's a lot of love for the community from the residents of Solano Canyon. And Sarah could definitely talk more about what happened afterwards, what are the sort of the follow-up conversations and initiatives that might have taken place after the event. All right, so just one final concluding slide in terms of lessons, like key lessons learned. As I mentioned, the existing best practice, and this is the student, the studio group. So as I mentioned earlier, the existing best practices in fire resilient and design don't really provide much guidance for denser urban neighborhoods. So that's a gap in practice and research that really needs to be filled because it's not just the suburban subdivision neighborhoods that are at risk of fire events. And existing best practices predominantly focus on individual properties and rely on individual homeowners doing their own part, but really not on community scale innovative interventions. So that's another area that I would love to see more work being done in this in the professional world and the research space. One thing that we didn't anticipate going in, I didn't anticipate going in, but was a real challenge and a learning experience, honestly, in this studio, leading this studio, was that fire resiliency efforts will run into competing policy priorities. And in this context, we ran into the need for denser housing development. So what does it mean to build more housing uh, in the face of housing affordability crisis when these communities are at risk, at high fire risks? And for example, if you're trying to relax, sprinkler requirement for ADUs, should that apply to communities like Solano Canyon? So those were the conversations that came up during our studio project, and then not specific to Solano Canyon, but what we did and which we didn't anticipate going in was the need to accommodate the unhoused population. So what we realized as we were conducting this studio project was that a lot of the sources and ignition and points for Solano Canyon's recent fire events came from the living quarters of unhoused population. And this was beyond the scope of what we anticipated going in. But at the same time, the students wanted to be mindful of the mindful of this unhoused population's presence in and around Solano Canyon, and we recommended and sort of gave a plead to the community to take into consideration the unhoused population as part of the broader community, and to be able to work with unhoused population to reduce the causes of fire ignition in these unhoused populations living quarters. And then finally, despite all of our effort to do translation, to do outreach, we did flyers, we, talked to neighbors. Sarah was trying to get her neighbor, Cantonese speaking neighbor, to, also organize and get more people to the community event. It just was really difficult. We were not, and we actually did mail-in flyers. So this was like an old school with we had a whole operation in the classroom with envelopes and stamp and our flyers. We mailed it to all of the mailing addresses in Solano Canyon. So we did all we could have done at that time. But despite all of our efforts, it wasn't really a successful effort in terms of getting the multi-language speaking or the Spanish speaking and Cantonese speaking population to come out and be involved in this conversation that we did twice in Solano Canyon. So with language barrier, cultural differences, and high renter population, collective action is going to be the most challenging in such communities. So with that, this is the final report and the QR code that you can download. I believe Maddie will also have a QR code when we conclude the webinar. But for those of you who are interested in reading the extensive work that the students have done last year in this site planning studio, please download and let me know if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas as we move forward in this very precarious but promising and promising space. All right, that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you so much, Benji. This was incredibly informative. I think, really hits home the need for advanced thinking before disasters hit, and just the overlapping vulnerabilities that people in these communities like in Solano Canyon, I think communities like Solano Canyon face in terms of trying to figure out a path forward. And I could ask you more questions more now, and I think there's a great discussion we'll have. But I want to turn it over to Sarah Harris for some of the comments kind of on her side of the experience. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. So, Sarah?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Madeline and Minji, and your whole studio class. I have to start off by giving my deep gratitude on behalf of my neighbors and myself and our tiny nonprofit that this was a really eye-opening experience for us, and it served our neighborhood in ways that may not have hit home to all of the students. But if you're all there listening, you guys need to know that what you did in our neighborhood was way more than what the city has ever offered us by way of preparedness and just conversation about the realities of things. So thank you, Madeline. And I have a couple of I have a list of things. I dropped a few links in the chat. This is my most amazing map behind me of my neighborhood. It's from the Metabolic Studio, if you can see it. That big blob is Dodger Stadium, and the green space is, it looks sepia, it's grayscale. But in the chat, I dropped a map of Elysian Park from Friends of Elysian Park, and I also dropped a designation of the definition of wildlife urban interface from the National Park Service, because I'm not entirely sure where Professor Kim is drawing the not technically wooey community for our neighborhood, but we are, so the overarching and defining aspect of this tiny little neighborhood is that we are surrounded by the second largest municipal park in the city of Los Angeles. So just after Griffith Park, Elysian Park is the biggest municipal park. And when it comes to invasive species and land management, they are our biggest benevolent neighbor. And when it comes to multi-jurisdictionality and the ability to have some sort of forward-facing impact, meaning, what do we do moving forward, and advanced thinking, as Madeline said. I'm sort of coming backwards, lollipopping on the last things you guys said, but I think advanced doing before disaster hits is way better than advanced thinking. There's a lot of thinking that happens around Elysian Park, and at the end of the day, if you guys look at the topography map that Professor Kim dropped in the very beginning, we are a low-lying area at basically sea level, surrounded by what goes up to almost 4,500 feet escarpments in this park. And so when winds come through, like they did on January 7th and 8th and 9th of last year, they really rip through a tiny canyon like this. And luckily they ripped across. But if we're thinking about forward motion and extremely vulnerable communities linguistically, demographically, and also just socioeconomically, as we are, I think that in Los Angeles, we're fighting a losing battle. And I hate to say that, and I feel that way living in this neighborhood. So that's the doom and gloom aspect of what I have to say. But I think the positive parts that I wanted to really respond to, and I'll be quick, is I think that just having people on the ground and doing outreach and having conversations is super important. We had a representative from she's a retired fire chief from the Los Angeles Fire Department, speak with us and point out, points of ignition. They're all over the place in this little neighborhood. So we are historic, we're small, but really if you scaled this neighborhood up with houses from, built in 1896. So if you go to Koreatown, you're going to see the same type of housing stock, but it's a flat plain. And it's surrounded by Vermont and Western. And yes, you've got, MacArthur Park on one side. You've got Hancock Park on the other side. You have fire stations in between, but basically it's a flatland. It's not a canyon. And so if you look, I would say, to like East High or the Franklin Hills, you've got two very distinct forms of renting and ownership. And you've got multi-million-dollar homes in one land, and you've got people renting who are still using Section 8 housing vouchers on the other hand, but they are both adjacent to municipal properties and multi-jurisdictional properties that are not being managed well by the city and by the owners. And so I wanted to come back to something that Professor Kim pointed out, Minji, about just the absentee land ownership and points of ignition. So there's this really wonderful slide that they came up with, the Creating Defensible Space slide. And this is what our neighbors had to take away when we had the community event, which was also great because it's something you can actually point to, and it it goes past language barriers, and we can talk to each other about like, hey, this is not the safest thing to have next to your house. That doesn't mean anyone would do something about it, but at least, to be forewarned is one thing. The other aspect is that with an aging population and also a population of people that doesn't feel agency. So again, I would come back to East Hollywood, near like the Runyon Canyon area. I'd come to our neighborhood surrounded by Elysian Park and a lot of empty and vacant lots. Climate change is happening right now, and it's been happening, but right now it's on a fast track because there's no way that zone 0, and this also rolls back to something that that Minji and Madeline just pointed out, which is density and advanced thinking and what the state requires of us. So if we go to zone 0, which is going to go into effect in the next 3 years for property owners, as an owner, I know that, and I can look at my trees and think, oh my God, can I even afford to do what I'm supposed to do in 3 years with these trees? And then second, I say, well, is anyone even going to enforce it? Probably not, because they're going to be paying attention to the Olympics, and I'm just being real talk with you folks. But if I'm a renter, do I even care about zone 0, or if my landlord isn't enforcing it? Probably not. Do I care about my own safety? Yes. And so I think that this is part of the forward conversation about not just the thinking, but the doing, is to get ahead of knowing what is required, knowing what is legislation, and then knowing what's enforced and what the ability is for people who live in these vulnerable areas. So if you look at that map that I put up of Elysian Park, we have on average during high fire season, every 2 weeks fire on the hillsides. And yes, many of those fires are lit by people keeping warm and living in the park, but also some of those fires are lit by people like doing drugs that require ignition in the park. And I know this because we go and we talk to LAFD. We're fire station number 1, the oldest station house in the city of Los Angeles. They have to respond to fire in this, which is Council District 1's office. The park itself, and I keep coming back to Elysian Park because we are a community, a neighborhood of 1,000 some households, but we are inside a municipal park. So Echo Park is on the other side. That's CD13. That's Hugo Soto Martinez's district. They have 2 other fire stations that respond, but they rarely have fires like we do on these hillsides. And part of that is because of the exposure to Caltrans and on and off ramps from the 5 freeway and the 110 freeway, and all the open land that's just underutilized in this area. So we do have a reservoir, as Minji pointed out. It is it's for the city to use. I'm not sure that once in a while they will come and pull big bellies over the reservoir to put out like really large fires. They did last year in January. But other than that, it's really just it's an underutilized resource sitting way up in the hills here. What else could I talk about that really resonated with what you brought up? I guess the last thing I would say is the home hardening aspect. If there were some way that you all, as students of public affairs and public education and advocacy, could think of resiliency in terms of equity, regional equity, and environmental equity, and think about ways in which we could work together as a population, and not consider necessarily the fact that it's really hard to organize. We've been told that 1,000 times in this neighborhood, and yet we will keep organizing, because at the end of the day, it's life and limb. And we have pets, we have elderly, we have people who don't speak English as a first language or even a second. We have people who are of limited mobility, and this goes for the entire city of Los Angeles. And so as things get worse, and as fuels accumulate on empty lots, and those empty lots will be looked at for development purposes. One thing that has come up recently, and I guess this is also a forward motion aspect, that with our nonprofit and Northeast Trees and Friends of Elysian Park, and I'll drop those in the chat too, and our neighbors, is we know that the property values for larger lots in this area of Los Angeles have gone up to over 1.4 or $5 million. And this is for a place with a tiny little house like mine, that was built in the 19-teens or 20s, and is perhaps not even very well cared for anymore, with usually elderly residents. And those lots are coming up for sale and being purchased by developers because of the changes like SB 79, which I think you all know, right, allows for 9 high transit-oriented development, and goes past CEQA. And so the competing agendas at the state level, and then the city, of course, pushed back against SB 79 and had a resolution that they don't want city zoning to be subjected to what the state decides, because the city of LA has very specific and different needs. However, that opened the window for developers now to look at these lots and these houses in all over the city, in neighborhoods like this one, where you do have owners who are elderly and who would be willing to sell, and they'll probably tear those houses down, is our guess. There's no way that the house itself is worth that much. And also, the one thing that didn't come up is insurance. So homeowners insurance, if you own a home in a place like Solano Canyon, or any of the wildlife urban interface areas, that because of what happened during the Palisades and Eaton fires, you can no longer get a homeowner's policy if you buy a new home. State Farm, okay, 10 minutes. Okay, well, I'm done. I'll just leave it at that. Look up the insurance regulations, and I'll stop. And thank you for letting me know, Madeline. Done.
No problem. I know, Sarah, there's a lot to talk about here. And just, thank you so much for kind of perspective of, reflecting on what the students found, and, just kind of the broader context in the community. I just want to quickly, if folks have specific questions for Sarah or Minji, I mean, welcome to use the Q&A function or put it in the chat. But Minji, one of your slides I thought was a really good way to think about what we could plan for doing, and to Sarah's point, what what to actually be done, right? To go from both planning to actually doing stuff. So you had a slide that your students came up with, which was kind of looking at a variety of solutions, both from short term to long term and low cost to high cost. And it seems like the great place to start is in those low cost, short term ideas. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about some of those suggestions and, yeah, if there's kind of the feasibility of how those would happen too.
Right. So the slide, the particular slide that you're referring to, we were, as you're mentioning, placing different interventions along the line of long-term, short-term to long-term, and then low cost to high cost for community hardening projects. So this was not necessary. And then we had a separate, separate comparable draft for home hardening. So what individual owners can do and what is the cost and the relative benefit of those interventions. But in terms of the community-wide interventions the working and community-wide hardening efforts, obviously, for example, the extreme case would be the undergrounding of power lines. Will that happen? Probably not in the next, I don't even know. So instead of focusing efforts on the, pie in the sky interventions, students wanted to start small. So for example, landscape management and the eucalyptus tree, that seemed to be a really effective, focusing on eucalyptus trees and managing eucalyptus trees in and around the community seem to be a really good and effective starting point. That is not necessarily, it's not easy, but it's doable, like in collaboration with LA Recs and Parks, and getting some political support, financial support. I think that would be the one priority that students pointed out. And then also like evacuation wise, the pedestrian improvements, because there are pedestrian connections from the community out to evacuate, but those connection points are, like really ill-maintained, dark, dangerous. And so focusing on that key bottleneck point would be another cost-effective and intervention, the community intervention that could happen.
And Sarah, is this like kind of thinking about the management of the eucalyptus trees? Is this something that's come up in the community before? And are these trees mostly kind of in the residential areas, in the park itself, or both?
They're only in the park land. And so I actually have a giant piece of a eucalyptus tree that I asked the rec and parks, they were cutting some down. We've been advocating to remove the dead and dying ones. The eucalyptus trees have a lifespan of about 80 years maximum. They're not native, and we call them candlesticks. So the city Rec and Parks really has responded. That's why I dropped Northeast Trees in the chat. You need advocate groups who the park wants to work with and bypass everything else. And then the Rec and Parks will listen to them, and they'll do what they're told to do.
Sarah, if you don't mind me asking, I know that you were working with Aaron from Northeast Trees on some sort of project on Radio Hill. How's that project going?
Oh, that's great. That's like a super happy story. So, Northeast Trees, they have done the rewilding of the Los Angeles River, and they work in Watts, Jordan Downs, the Imperial Courts. They work now all over LA County, but they really focused on this part of Los Angeles to start. And
sorry, Sarah. Sorry for interruption. So for the audience, the Radio Hill is the southern chunk of Elysian Park that that Solano Canyon sits within.
Here, look, I love doing this.
Sarah's gonna take us on a tour to a
this
new
is my
map.
visual.
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
here's Radio Hill. You guys see it? And that's my neighborhood. So Radio Hill is part of Elysian Park. There's a repeater for the fire department and the police on the top of that hill that is over 100 years old now, and it has been preserved as part of the park. And it catches fire, as I said, every couple of weeks during high fire season for various reasons. And so, yes, with these three nonprofits, Friends of Elysian Park, Northeast Trees, and our tiny nonprofit, we have an agreement now that we're working on with Rec and Parks so that we can work on resiliency and have a native nursery there and do some invasive removal with the community for like community service hours, et cetera. And then also just reactivate and use that as a way to educate people with what we know about what we've been learning with this project and just the facts, at hand.
That's great. I'm glad that that's in the works.
Yeah, and I think just kind of wrapping us up, some of the lessons in this, I feel like it always comes down to like a pretty almost too standard, but it's always bears repeating, is that like partnerships is essentially going to be necessary, right? Like that, whether it's Sarah's example of, the environmental advocacy groups coming together with the city, or some of the, different overlapping groups that Minji put together in the chart about kind of tenants' rights and emergency preparedness, or just the partnership between education, kind of public universities and community groups. Like it's just, these partnerships are really what allows small organizations, which is a lot of Los Angeles, to have a greater impact. And so this is a really great example, I think, of students that got a chance to learn about a new community, to have conversations, and hopefully this can start to kind of get us towards more examples. I think, as Minji pointed out, that, fire safety and community hardening is just going to look and has to be thought about very, very different in our dense urban communities of Los Angeles. These are not, properties with lots of defensible space that you can just do brush clearance. It needs a lot more thoughtfulness and a lot more interconnectedness, and ways to just think about how you kind of create social cohesion at areas of kind of interlapping sources of vulnerability. So I just want to share my screen to wrap us up. See if I can actually get it to work here. Okay, 1 second here. So Minji put, and I think colleagues put in the chat, but if you would like to learn more about this work, we encourage you to read the report from the site planning class. It's on our Lewis Center website under publications, as well as the link that was in the chat. This webinar will be on our YouTube channel in a week or so, very quickly. So if you have other colleagues that you think should learn from this, we'll have this available for future learning. I just want to encourage everyone to stay up to date and keep in touch with the Lewis Center. We love to feature work like this. If you see a report and you'd like us to host a webinar so that you can, ask questions and share this work more broadly, please drop us a line. We'd love to figure out more ways to share and disseminate our work. So with that, I really want to thank all of our attendees today, and Minji Kim and Sarah Harris, and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.